The aliens were shocked beyond belief as they uncovered the labs where humanity had created perfectly engineered warbeasts to unleash upon the galaxy, creatures that were an abomination of science, yet a work of strategic genius. Dr. Ilara's heart raced as she watched the ancient human outpost's airlock cycle open with a hiss, revealing the eerie silence of the abandoned complex. She motioned for her Tzenkethi archaeology team to follow her inside, tightening her grip on the plasma cutter. The decaying corridors were strewn with debris and strange glyphs, dire warnings scrawled in an unknown language. Ilara's curiosity drove her forward. "Over here," Tarok called out, his headlamp illuminating a reinforced blast door. "These markings, I've never seen anything like them." Ilara ran her gloved fingers over the symbols. Ancient human script, indecipherable. Her mandibles clicked with anticipation as she overrode the locking mechanism. The door groaned open, revealing a cavernous chamber. Rows of massive stasis pods lined the walls, each one large enough to hold a small starship. "By the moons of Tzenketh," Ilara whispered, wiping grime from a pod's viewport. She recoiled in horror at the sight within, a nightmarish beast, an abomination of science. Hulking muscles beneath thick armor plating, vicious claws and fangs, too many eyes, a chimera of apex predators built for raw savagery. Ilara realized with dread that the humans had not just been experimenting, but perfecting the art of monster-making. A power surge suddenly ripped through the room. The pods hissed open one by one. The creatures began to stir. If even one of these engineered warbeasts got loose, they could slaughter her entire team in minutes. And if they bred, an unstoppable swarm would ravage entire worlds. Ilara needed to seal this tomb, this twisted monument to human genius, before the galaxy paid the price for her curiosity. The pods burst open with a hiss of escaping gas, and the monstrous creatures within began to stir. Their eyes, too many eyes, blinked open, and they flexed their claws, testing their strength. Ilara's team scrambled back in horror as the beasts began to extract themselves from their metal wombs. "Run!" Ilara screamed, her voice cracking with terror. "Run!" They fled, hearts pounding through the twisting corridors of the complex. The sounds of pursuit followed them, the heavy thud of armored feet, the scrape of claws on metal. Ilara led her team through the maze, her mind racing until they reached a heavy blast door. She slammed her fist on the control panel, and the door groaned shut just as the first of the creatures rounded the corner. Inside the control room, Ilara leaned against the door, gasping for breath. Her team looked to her, their eyes wide with fear. She turned to the central computer, still operational after all these years. She had to find a way to contain these horrors. Her fingers flew over the unfamiliar interface, searching for answers. A holographic recording flickered to life, the image of a haggard human man in a lab coat. "My name is Dr. David Murphy," the recording began, the man's voice heavy with exhaustion and something else, something that sent a chill down Ilara's spine. "If you're seeing this, then you've found what's left of Project Chimera." He went on to explain the unthinkable, that these creatures were engineered as biological weapons, designed to defend against an impending alien invasion. Murphy's team had spliced together DNA from the deadliest predators in the known universe, creating killing machines that were strong, fast, intelligent, and utterly merciless. As Murphy spoke, the creatures battered at the sealed door, their roars echoing through the control room. Ilara delved deeper into the logs, her horror growing with each revelation. The creatures were meant to be controlled by neural implants, but they had evolved, had learned to resist, and the final log entry played, showing Murphy disheveled and spattered with blood. "The implants failed," he said, his voice shaking. "The chimeras, they turned on us, slaughtered everyone. God help us all if they ever get off this rock." The recording cut out, leaving Ilara in stunned silence. She looked to her team, saw the same realization dawning in their eyes. The creatures, these chimeras, had been trapped here for decades, and now, because of them, they were free. The pounding on the reinforced door intensified, the inhuman shrieks of the creatures sending chills down Ilara's spine. Her fingers flew across the unfamiliar interface, desperately searching for anything that could give them an edge against these monstrous creations. "There has to be something here," she muttered, her mandibles clicking with frustration. "Some weakness, some way to stop them." As if in answer, a new set of schematics flashed across the screen. Ilara's eyes widened as she took in the detailed diagrams of the creature's physiology. There, at the base of their skulls, was a small, unarmored spot, a chink in their otherwise impenetrable defenses. "That's it," she breathed. "If we can hit that spot with a focused energy blast, it should kill them instantly." But her elation was short-lived as she read further. The creatures were not just mindless beasts. They possessed a rudimentary hive mind, allowing them to coordinate and strategize as a group. Taking them head-on would be suicide. Ilara's gaze darted across the screen, searching for anything else that could help. A map of the facility caught her eye, revealing a network of service tunnels running beneath the main corridors. "If we can lure them into these tunnels," she said, tracing the narrow passages with a claw, "we might be able to isolate them, take them out one by one." Her team exchanged uneasy glances. It was a desperate plan, but what choice did they have? "I'll act as bait," Ilara said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. "Draw them into the tunnels. The rest of you take up positions at these junctures." She indicated several key points on the map. "When I give the signal, hit them with everything you've got. Aim for the base of the skull." As she prepared to leave the relative safety of the control room, a final piece of information caught Ilara's eye, and her blood ran cold. According to the files, there had originally been over 100 creatures in stasis, but in the chamber she had counted only a dozen pods. A terrible realization dawned on her. The rest of the creatures, they were already loose somewhere in the facility, and now, thanks to her team's actions, they were free to hunt. With no time to ponder the fate of the missing creatures, Ilara steeled herself and put her desperate plan into action. She left the relative safety of the control room, stepping out into the dimly lit corridors that twisted like a malevolent labyrinth. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm in her chest as she crept forward, straining her senses for any sign of the beasts. In the distance, echoing off the metal walls, she could hear them, the heavy thud of their footfalls, the guttural snarls that sent chills racing down her spine. They were coming. Ilara quickened her pace, making for the entrance to the service tunnels. As she reached the yawning mouth of the narrow passage, she paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, she began to bang on the walls, shouting at the top of her lungs. It worked. The snarls grew louder, closer, more frenzied. Ilara could almost feel the vibrations of their approach through the floor. Just as the first nightmare creature rounded the corner, its too many eyes glinting with predatory hunger, Ilara ducked into the tunnels. The passages were narrow, claustrophobic, the perfect place for an ambush, but also the perfect place to be trapped. Ilara raced through the twisting tunnels, the creatures hot on her heels. She could hear their claws scraping against the metal, could feel the heat of their breath on the back of her neck. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, but she pushed on, rounding a corner, just as one of the beasts lunged for her. Its claws raked the air mere inches from her face. Ilara nearly sobbed with relief as she reached the junction where Tarok and Kezra were lying in wait. As she dove past them, they opened fire, their energy weapons searing the air. The creature chasing Ilara screeched in agony as the blasts found its weak point, and it crumpled to the ground, a smoking ruin. But there was no time to celebrate. More creatures were coming, drawn by the noise and the scent of their fallen comrade. Ilara and her team fell back, deeper into the tunnels, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse. They would lure the beasts in, pick them off one by one, then move on to the next junction, the next ambush point. It was working, but Ilara knew they were running out of tunnels, running out of time. And then, as they rounded another corner, they came face to face with a sight that froze the blood in her veins. And its belly was distended, writhing with unnatural life. The Queen's roar shook the tunnels, a sound that resonated in Ilara's bones. The massive creature charged, its bloated body moving with a speed that defied its size. Ilara and her team opened fire, their energy weapons searing the air, but the blasts seemed to bounce harmlessly off the Queen's thick armored hide. Ilara's mind raced as she realized the horrifying truth. The Queen had evolved beyond the original creature's design. Their weapons were useless against it. "Fall back!" Ilara shouted over the din of the Queen's approach. "Scatter!" Her team obeyed without hesitation, splitting off into the maze of tunnels. The Queen's footsteps thundered behind them, growing louder with each passing second. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest as she ran, her mind desperately seeking a solution. And then a memory flashed through her mind, a room on the facility map labeled Incinerator. If they could lure the Queen there, trap it inside. Ilara activated her comm unit. "Listen up, we need to lead it to the incinerator room. It's our only chance." Acknowledgements crackled over the line as her team changed course, converging on the location. The Queen followed, its roars echoing through the tunnels. As they approached the incinerator room, Ilara's heart sank. The door was sealed, the controls on the other side. Someone would have to go in, activate the incinerator manually. It was a suicide mission. Before Ilara could even begin to form the words, Zorin, her second-in-command, sprinted past her. He dove through the doorway, rolling to his feet on the other side. The Queen was right behind him, its massive form filling the tunnel. Zorin slammed his fist down on the incinerator controls, just as the Queen burst into the room. The door sealed shut, trapping them both inside. A moment later, the incinerator roared to life. Ilara and the others could only watch in horror through the small viewport as flames engulfed the room. The Queen's shrieks mingled with the roar of the fire, a hellish symphony. And amidst it all, Zorin stood tall, his eyes meeting Ilara's through the viewport. In that moment, a look of peace crossed his face, a silent farewell. Then the flames consumed him and he was gone. As the roar of the incinerator faded to an eerie quiet, Ilara and her team stood in stunned silence, staring at the sealed door that had become Zorin's tomb. The weight of his sacrifice hung heavy in the air, but there was no time to mourn. They were still deep in the heart of this nightmarish facility, and they knew their mission was far from over. Ilara turned to her remaining team members, her voice low and urgent. "We need to find a way off this moon and warn the Tzenkethi government. They have to know what the humans were doing here, the horrors they created." As they turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught Ilara's eye. She whipped around, her plasma cutter at the ready, and froze. There, scurrying along the wall, was a small reptilian creature, no larger than her hand. A hatchling. Ilara's mind raced, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. The Queen, she must have laid eggs somewhere in the facility. And now, with the disturbance they'd caused, those eggs were starting to hatch. "Search the nearby rooms," Ilara commanded, her voice tight with urgency. "We have to find where she's nested." They moved quickly, checking each room with growing desperation. And then, in a vast chamber not far from the incinerator, they found it. Hundreds of eggs, each about the size of Ilara's head, filled the room. Many were already shuddering, cracks spreading across their leathery surfaces. Kezra, the youngest of the team, took a step back, his eyes wide with horror. "Suns above, there's so many of them." Ilara nodded grimly. "We have to destroy them, all of them, before they can hatch and escape into the galaxy." But before they could even begin to formulate a plan, a sound echoed through the corridors that turned Ilara's blood to ice. Snarls, growls, the scrape of claws against metal. More of the creatures, coming from deep within the facility. Tarok, his face grim, turned to Ilara. "The Queen and the ones we killed, they were just a fraction of the whole. The rest of them, they're waking up." Ilara's grip tightened on her weapon, a cold realization settling in her gut. They were vastly outnumbered, and time was running out. The hatchlings would mature quickly, and once they did, there would be no stopping them. "We need to find a way to destroy the entire facility," she said, her voice hard with resolve. "It's the only way to make sure none of these abominations survive." But as the growls drew closer and the eggs began to hatch, Ilara knew that their chances of success were slim. They were racing against the clock in a battle for the fate of the galaxy itself, and the odds were not in their favor. Ilara's mind spun as she tried to formulate a plan. They needed something big, something that could take out the entire outpost in one fell swoop. Her eyes fell on the incinerator, still glowing with residual heat. "The facility's power core," she said, the idea taking shape even as she spoke. "If we can overload it, trigger a meltdown." "It would vaporize everything within a kilometer," Tarok finished, catching on, "including us." Ilara nodded, a grim smile touching her mandibles. A small price to pay to ensure these horrors never see the light of day. They moved as one, racing through the corridors towards the central power chamber. Behind them, the snarls of the creatures grew louder, closer. They were being hunted. In the power chamber, Ilara worked frantically at the controls, her fingers flying over the unfamiliar human technology. Sweat beaded on her brow, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a blade. "I've almost got it," she said, her voice strained. "Just a few more seconds." But those seconds were seconds they didn't have. The door to the chamber burst open, and the creatures poured in, a writhing mass of claws and teeth and fury. Kezra screamed as one of the beasts leapt at him, its jaws closing around his throat. Tarok fired, the plasma blast taking the creature in the side, but more were coming, too many to count. Ilara's finger hovered over the final sequence, the one that would send the power core into a cascade failure. She looked at her team, at the monsters bearing down on them, and made her choice. Tarok shook his head even as he fired into the horde. "Ilara, no." "That's an order," Ilara snapped. "Go now!" With a last anguished look, Tarok obeyed, grabbing Kezra and dragging him towards the door. Ilara turned back to the console, her finger poised over the button. With a final defiant roar, Ilara slammed her fist down on the console. The world went white, then red, then black. In the shuttles, racing away from the doomed outpost, Tarok and Kezra watched as the facility exploded, a miniature sun blooming on the surface of the moon. They sat in silence, the weight of what they'd seen, what they'd lost, settling over them like a shroud. They were the only ones left now, the only ones who knew the truth about the horrors humanity had created, and as they set a course for Tsenkithi space, they knew that their fight was only just beginning. Ilara's fingers flew across the control room's console, her heart pounding, as she searched desperately for a way to stop the nightmarish creatures. Her team huddled around her, their faces etched with fear and desperation. The snarls and screeches of the beasts echoed through the corridors, drawing ever closer. "There has to be something here," Ilara muttered, her mandibles clicking with frustration. "Some way to purge the facility, to make sure these abominations never leave this moon." As she scanned through the files, a particular entry caught her eye. Project Tartarus, Emergency Purge Protocol. With a trembling claw, she opened the file. A schematic of the facility appeared on the screen, a pulsing red dot at its center. Antimatter Reactor Core, the label read. Ilara's breath caught in her throat as she read the accompanying text. In the event of a containment breach, the reactor core could be overloaded, triggering a massive antimatter explosion that would vaporize the entire facility and everything in it. A last resort, a failsafe put in place by the humans to prevent their creations from ever escaping. "This is it," she breathed, "our only chance?" But as she studied the schematic more closely, a chill ran down her spine. The reactor core was located at the very heart of the facility, deep underground. The only way to access it was through a series of heavily fortified chambers, each one likely crawling with more of the monstrous creatures. "It's a suicide mission," Tarok said grimly, voicing the thought that hung heavy in the air. "We'll have to fight our way down, level by level, with those things nipping at our heels the whole way." Ilara closed her eyes, the weight of their situation bearing down on her. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and running out of time. But if they didn't act, if they allowed even one of these creatures to escape the facility, Ilara opened her eyes, a steely resolve settling over her. She turned to her team, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. "Suit up," she said. "We're going in. We'll fight our way to the reactor core and we'll blow this place to hell. We'll make sure these abominations never see the light of day." Her team nodded, a grim determination in their eyes. They knew the odds, knew that they likely wouldn't survive this mission, but they also knew that they had no choice. As they prepared their weapons and checked their suits, the sounds of the creatures grew louder, closer. The Queen's brood was coming, drawn by the scent of their prey. Ilara led her team out of the control room, into the dimly lit corridors that twisted like a malevolent labyrinth. With each step, they descended deeper into the heart of the facility, into the waiting jaws of the nightmare that lurked below. Their steps heavy with grim purpose, Ilara and her team checked their weapons one last time, ensuring each plasma cutter and energy rifle was fully charged. They reinforced the weak points in their spacesuits as best they could, sealing tiers with emergency patches. The suits would have to hold, they had no other choice. As they approached the first fortified chamber, an unearthly chorus of shrieks and snarls rose from the depths, the echoes distorted by the twisting corridors into something truly nightmarish. Ilara and her team exchanged glances, each face a mask of fear barely held in check by sheer force of will. Ilara hit the door controls, and the heavy blast doors groaned open. The chamber beyond was a charnel house. The walls were painted with splashes of crimson human blood, and the sickly green ichor of the creatures. Corpses littered the floor, some still in the tattered remains of lab coats, others nothing more than bloody smears. And among the dead, the living horrors lurched to their feet, turning towards the intruders with bared fangs and razor claws. Ilara and her team opened fire, the air thick with the hiss of energy weapons and the stench of seared flesh. The creatures fell, one by one, their tough hides no match for the concentrated fire. But more came, scrambling over the bodies of their fallen brethren, pouring out of vents and crawl spaces. They seemed to be without number, an endless tide of fangs and claws and mindless hunger. Ilara and her team fought their way forward, wading through the carnage, the creatures pressing in from all sides. In the chaos, Kezra fell, dragged down by a swarm of the beasts, his screams drowned out by their frenzied snarls. Moments later, Tarok went down, firing until his weapon clicked empty, the creatures ripping into him. By the time they reached the final chamber, only Ilara and Kirin remained, both wounded, their suits torn and leaking precious air. But they couldn't stop. Not now. Not with the fate of the galaxy hanging in the balance. As they approached the massive blast door to the reactor core, a bone-chilling shriek filled the air. They turned to see the Queen emerging from the shadows, her massive bulk filling the corridor, more creatures swarming around her feet. Ilara and Kirin exchanged a glance, a silent understanding. As the Queen charged, they split apart, Kirin firing into the horde of creatures, drawing their attention. Ilara ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs burning with every step. The reactor controls were just ahead. If she could just reach them in time, if she could just hold out a few seconds more. Ilara's heart pounded as she lunged for the reactor controls, her fingers flying over the keys with desperate speed. Behind her, Kirin's screams turned to wet gurgles, the sound of flesh tearing and bones crunching under the onslaught of the creatures. Tears streamed down Ilara's face as she input the final command, the reactor beginning to whine with a high-pitched intensity. She spun to face the Queen, the monstrous creature bearing down on her with murderous intent. Ilara raised her weapon and fired again and again, pouring all her rage and grief into each shot. The Queen staggered, her thick hide smoking, but she kept coming, relentless. Click, click. Ilara's weapon ran dry and she braced herself for the end, the Queen's fetid breath hot on her face. But just as the Queen reared back to strike, a massive explosion rocked the chamber. Ilara flew off her feet, the world spinning in a dizzying kaleidoscope of light and shadow. She hit the ground hard, the breath driven from her lungs. Ilara dragged herself to the exit, every movement an agony. She could feel the heat of the reactor at her back, the searing wind of the impending blast tugging at her suit. She stumbled into the corridor, the door slamming shut behind her with a resounding clang. She managed a few staggering steps, then collapsed, her strength spent. As she lay there, the world fading around her, a voice crackled over her suit's radio. It was Dr. David Murphy, the lead scientist from the holologs. But it wasn't a recording. It was live. "Ilara," Murphy said, his voice strained. "If you're hearing this, then you've done it. You've activated the purge protocol." He paused, and Ilara could hear the weight of years in that silence. "I'm sorry for all you've been through, for all I've put you through. But you have to understand, we had no choice." Ilara lay there, the world fading around her, Murphy's voice echoing in her head. His words were a haunting confession from beyond the grave, a revelation that chilled her to her core. "The creatures you fought," Murphy said, his voice strained, "they were just the beginning, a prototype. We were working on something far worse, something that would make the Queen look like a house pet." Ilara's blood ran cold as Murphy described the true nature of the experiments. It wasn't just about creating biological weapons, but about fusing human consciousness with the creatures' bodies, creating an army of unstoppable super soldiers. "But we went too far," Murphy said, his voice cracking. "We couldn't control them. They broke free, and they took over the facility. I had to seal them inside, had to activate the purge." Ilara's mind reeled with the implications. If the creatures she had fought were just prototypes, then what horrors might the humans have unleashed if their experiments had been completed? A sudden tremor shook the facility, snapping Ilara back to the present. She realized with dread that the reactor explosion had destabilized the moon's core. The whole place was going to blow. Gritting her teeth against the pain, Ilara dragged herself to her feet. She staggered towards the exit, her vision blurring, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Every step was agony, but she pushed on, driven by the primal need to survive. She stumbled into the airlock just as the facility collapsed behind her. A roiling fireball consumed everything in its path, the heat searing her back even through her suit. Ilara scrambled into her shuttle, her fingers fumbling with the controls. The small craft shuddered as it lifted off, the shockwave from the exploding moon buffeting it like a leaf in a storm. Ilara held on, her knuckles white as the shuttle broke orbit. She looked back at the devastation below. The human outpost and all its terrible secrets had been wiped from existence. But even as relief washed over her, Murphy's final words echoed in her mind. Ilara slumped back in her seat, her body numb, her mind reeling. She had survived, but at what cost? And what other horrors might be lurking out there, waiting to be unleashed? As the stars blurred into streaks of light, Ilara closed her eyes, haunted by the knowledge that her mission, far from being over, may have only just begun. The shuttle drifted through the void, carrying her towards an uncertain future, towards a galaxy that suddenly seemed far darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Ilara's mind raced as she tried to process everything she had learned. The humans had not only been creating biological weapons, but they had been experimenting with something far more insidious, the fusion of human consciousness with these monstrous creatures. The implications were staggering. She thought back to the creatures she had fought, to their uncanny intelligence and coordination. Had they been more than just animals? Had there been a glimmer of human awareness behind those feral eyes? And then there were Murphy's final words, his warning about other facilities, other experiments. How many more of these nightmarish outposts were scattered across the galaxy? What horrors might they contain? Ilara knew she had to report back to the Tzenkethi authorities, had to warn them about the potential threat. But would they listen? Would they understand the magnitude of what she had uncovered? She had no answers, only a growing sense of unease that gnawed at her gut. As the shuttle hurtled through the star-flecked darkness, Ilara tried to find solace in the fact that she had at least stopped one of these facilities, had prevented its abominations from being unleashed upon the galaxy. But deep down she knew it was a hollow victory. For every secret she had uncovered, every horror she had faced, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was just the tip of the iceberg. Something far darker, far more sinister lurked beneath the surface, and she had a sinking suspicion that sooner or later she would have to confront it. Elara leaned back in her seat, her eyes drifting shut as exhaustion finally claimed her. But even in her dreams, she found no respite. The faces of the dead haunted her. Zorin, Chiron, all those who had fallen in that nightmarish place. And behind them, always lurking in the shadows, were the creatures, the twisted fruits of humanity's darkest ambitions. They stalked her through the corridors of her mind, their snarls echoing in the darkness, their too many eyes glinting with a predatory light. Elara jerked awake, her heart pounding, her body slick with sweat. The shuttle's autopilot beeped softly, a gentle reminder that she was still here, still alive. But for how long, and at what cost? These questions swirled in Elara's mind as the shuttle carried her onward, into the uncertain depths of space. She had survived the horrors of the outpost, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her true trials were only just beginning. The memory of Murphy's words haunted her, his voice seeming to whisper from the very shadows of the shuttle. There were other facilities, he had said, other experiments. The words took on a new and chilling significance now, laden with a dread portent of things to come. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.